I came home from an 11-month deployment to find my parking spot empty. My car was gone. My parents had sold it 3 months into my deployment for $4,000 less than it was worth to a stranger they found on a classified ad and used part of the money to help pay for my younger brother's spring break trip. Their explanation, when I called them from my apartment, standing in an empty driveway, still in uniform, was one sentence. You weren't using it, and we figured you don't really need a car where you are. They had no idea where I actually was. And in about 4 minutes, I'm going to tell you exactly what where I was meant, because it wasn't what they assumed, and what happened after they found out is the part of this story I still think about most. Quick facts, so you have them before anything else. I was 26, active duty. The car was a 2019 sedan I'd bought myself at 23, paid off in full before I ever deployed, registered and insured entirely in my own name. Not my parents' car, not a family car. Mine, bought with my own money, sitting in their driveway because I needed somewhere secure to store it while I was gone. They sold it without telling me. I found out when I landed. Now let me tell you exactly who these people are, and why you don't really need a car where you are, is one of the more insulting sentences I've ever heard in my life, because they genuinely had no idea what that sentence actually meant. My parents are Linda and Paul. My brother is Josh, 4 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, Josh has been the son my parents understood. He played football. He was loud and easy and social, in exactly the way my parents are, and every family gathering for 20 years has orbited around whatever Josh had going on. A game, a girlfriend, a job he'd started or quit. I was different. Quiet, methodical, the kid who read field manuals for fun in high school ROTC and knew by 16 that I wanted a military career, specifically something technical. I was also usually the only woman in the room in that world, which meant I'd gotten used, early, to being underestimated by people who'd never bothered to ask what I actually did, a pattern that turned out to extend all the way home. My parents supported the general idea of the military, the way people support things they don't understand. Vaguely, with pride they could perform at parties, but with almost zero curiosity about the actual details. Here's the thing you need to understand before we go further. My parents believed, genuinely and completely, that I worked a fairly standard support role. Admin, logistics, paperwork is a phrase my mother has used more than once. I never corrected that belief, mostly because my actual role required a level of discretion I'd gotten used to maintaining, even with family. And partly, if I'm honest, because for years it was easier to let them believe something small and safe about what I did than to have a conversation I wasn't sure they'd understand anyway. That gap between what they believed and what was actually true is the entire engine of this story. Keep it in your head. We're coming back to it. I want to give you 2 moments before the car because they explain exactly why my parents felt entitled to make that decision without asking me first. First, 2 years before I deployed, I sent money home, $6,000, most of my savings at the time, to help cover a gap after my father's hours got cut at work. I didn't make a big deal of it. It was my parents. They needed help. I had it. I sent it. What I didn't expect was that within a year, that $6,000 had quietly been recast, in family conversation, as evidence that I was doing great, and therefore didn't need to be checked on, worried about, or consulted about anything financial, while Josh, who has never once sent money home and has asked for it more times than I can count, remained the child my parents felt they needed to actively manage and protect. Second, and this is the one that really sets up the car, 6 months before I deployed, Josh totaled his car, his 3rd car in 5 years, each one lost to some combination of bad decisions and worse luck, and my parents, without a second thought, co-signed a loan for a replacement, adding real financial risk to their own name for a 26-year-old who demonstrated, repeatedly, that he couldn't be trusted with a vehicle. When I asked my mother, carefully, whether that felt like a lot of risk to take on again, she said, "He's trying, honey. You know how to take care of yourself. Josh needs more support. You know how to take care of yourself." I want you to remember that sentence, because 6 months later, my parents used my exact self-sufficiency as the justification for selling something of mine without asking. Here's where it gets specific. Here's exactly what "you don't really need a car where you are" actually meant, and why my parents had no way of knowing how wrong they were. For the 11 months I was gone, my parents believed I was stationed somewhere stable and low risk, doing administrative work, mostly because that's the vague story I'd let stand for years and never bothered to update. The truth was considerably different, and I'm going to give you the details I'm able to give you, understanding that some specifics of military deployments simply don't get discussed publicly, even years later. I was part of a technical support unit attached to a forward operating element, handling secure communications infrastructure in a deployment zone my parents would have found genuinely alarming had they understood it accurately. It wasn't a desk job. There were stretches of that deployment, weeks at a time, where communication home was limited or non-existent, not because I was avoiding my family, but because the nature of the work made regular contact impossible. My parents experienced those silences as me being busy or not calling enough, a low-grade grievance my mother brought up more than once during rare calls, with no idea that the actual reason was considerably more serious than a daughter too preoccupied to phone home. 3 months into that deployment, during one of those exact communication gaps, as it turned out, my parents made the decision to sell my car. They didn't attempt to contact me first, not because they couldn't reach me at all, but because, as my mother later admitted, "We figured you were busy, and it wasn't a big deal. We'd just tell you when you got back." A $4,000 loss on an asset I owned outright, decided without my knowledge, justified afterward as not being a big deal. They used part of the proceeds, around $1,500, to help cover Josh's spring break trip that year, a detail I only learned weeks after I'd already found out the car itself was gone. I landed on a Tuesday. I want to walk you through exactly what that day looked like, because the empty driveway was only the beginning of what I found out that week. I'd texted my mother my arrival details a week out, mostly out of habit. I didn't actually need a ride. A friend was picking me up from the base, but I wanted them to know I was home safe. Nobody mentioned anything about the car in that entire week of messages. Not a word. My friend dropped me at my apartment complex, where I'd left the car parked in a reserved spot at my parents' house, 3 streets over, because my own apartment didn't have secure long-term parking. I walked the 3 streets, duffel bag over my shoulder, still adjusting to being back on American soil, expecting to see my car exactly where I'd left it 11 months earlier. The spot was empty, just an oil stain on the concrete where it used to sit. I called my mother standing right there in that driveway. She answered cheerfully, the way she always does, asked how the flight was, mentioned dinner plans for the weekend, entirely unaware that I was staring at an empty patch of concrete with my heart rate climbing. I asked her, directly, where my car was. There was a pause, the specific kind of pause that tells you someone's deciding how to phrase something they already know is going to land badly. Then she said it. "Oh, honey, we sold it a while back. You weren't using it, and we figured you don't really need a car where you are. We can talk about it when you're settled." I didn't yell. I want to be honest, that my first reaction wasn't even anger. It was this strange, cold clarity, standing in that driveway in the uniform I'd been wearing on a transport flight for the last 18 hours, realizing exactly how little my parents actually understood about where I'd been and what I'd been doing for the last 11 months. I asked her what she meant by "where you are," because I wanted to hear, specifically, what she thought my deployment had actually looked like. She said something vague, over there, doing your thing, the desk work. And I let her finish, because I needed her to fully commit to the assumption before I corrected it. Then I told her, not everything, there are limits to what I'm able to share even now, but enough. I told her that the desk work had involved secure communications support for a forward element in an active deployment zone, that there were stretches of weeks where I genuinely could not contact home because of operational security requirements, not because I was too busy to call, and that the reason she hadn't heard from me during exactly the window they'd chosen to sell my car without asking was the same reason. I was in a position where communication home simply wasn't possible. I told her my actual clearance level. I told her, plainly, that you don't really need a car where you are, was a sentence she'd said with total confidence about a situation she had never once actually asked me a real question about, in 4 years of me being in that role. The silence on the other end of the phone was long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. That silence was just the beginning. What my father said 2 days later, at a dinner my parents insisted on hosting to talk this through, is the part of this story that actually changed something. My parents invited me to dinner 2 nights later, the kind of overly formal invitation that told me they'd spent the intervening 48 hours feeling genuinely rattled. Not just about the car, but about the gap between what they'd believed and what had actually been true. My father, who rarely leads difficult conversations in our family, was the one who spoke first. He said, carefully, that they hadn't understood, hadn't asked really, in 4 years, what my actual role involved, and that hearing it laid out plainly had made him go back through years of moments he was now looking at differently. The silences during deployments he'd chalked up to me not prioritizing family, the vague answers I'd give when people asked what I actually did over there. All of it, reframed suddenly against a reality he'd simply never bothered to ask about. My mother, to her credit, didn't try to minimize the car itself. She said, quietly, that the $4,000 mattered less to her in that moment than the realization that she'd made a decision about something of mine. During a communication gap she now understood the real reason for, and framed it afterward as not a big deal, when the truth was she'd simply never valued my life enough to ask real questions about it in the first place. I told them, honestly, that the car wasn't really the point anymore, even though it had started this conversation. The point was the pattern underneath it, that Josh's risk, his loans, his totaled cars, always received careful attention and real curiosity, while my life, including a job that had genuinely put me in dangerous positions for years, had been reduced to the desk work, because nobody had ever cared enough to ask a second question. My father asked, directly, what he could do to fix it. I told him the truth, that $4,000 could be repaid, and it eventually was, in full, within a month. But actually earning back a level of trust in how they treated my life going forward was going to take considerably longer than a bank transfer. I want to be honest that the weeks after that dinner weren't some clean, triumphant turning point. They were uncomfortable, for all of us, in a way that felt necessary, but not exactly satisfying. My parents did pay me back for the car, in full, within a month, no argument. That part was straightforward. What was harder, for all of us, was recalibrating years of a family dynamic built on the assumption that I was the low-maintenance one who didn't need real attention, while Josh was the one who required active management and protection. That assumption hadn't come from nowhere. I'd participated in building it, honestly, by staying vague about my job for years, because it was easier than having a harder conversation. Some of that responsibility was genuinely mine to own. What actually shifted, slowly, over the following months, was my parents starting to ask real questions, not performative ones, actual curiosity, about deployments, about my work, about what I could and couldn't share. My father, in particular, started reading more about the kind of role I held, unprompted, The way people research something, once they finally understand it, matters. It wasn't dramatic, it was small, consistent effort, which honestly meant more to me than any single apology could have. Josh and I had our own conversation eventually, separate from our parents. He didn't know about the spring break money coming from my car's sale, genuinely didn't know, and was visibly uncomfortable when he found out, which told me something real about him I hadn't fully credited him for before. He offered to pay me back his share directly, which I declined, because by that point the money had already been settled, and I didn't need two separate apologies for the same $4,000. What I did accept was him actually listening, for the first time in years, when I talked about my work, instead of changing the subject back to himself, within 90 seconds the way our whole family had trained itself to do around me for a decade. I've thought a lot about why this particular experience cut as deep as it did, beyond the obvious frustration of coming home to an empty driveway after 11 months away. I think it's because "you don't really need a car where you are" wasn't really about the car. It was a sentence built entirely on years of my family simply not asking. Not maliciously. I don't think my parents are bad people, and I don't think they set out to hurt me. I think they just quietly decided, over years, that I was fine, that I could handle myself, that my life didn't require the same active attention Josh's did, and once a family settles into that kind of shorthand, it becomes incredibly easy to make decisions, even significant ones, even about someone's actual property, without ever pausing to check whether the shorthand still matches reality. If you've ever been the low-maintenance one in your family, the kid who didn't cause problems, so nobody thought to ask how you were actually doing, I think you already recognize the shape of this story before I got anywhere near the deployment reveal. That particular kind of neglect doesn't look like cruelty from the outside. It looks like trust. It took me a long time to understand that being seen as low maintenance isn't actually the compliment it sounds like. Sometimes it just means nobody's paying close enough attention to notice what you actually need. If you've made it this far, I want to know, were you ever the responsible one in your family, the one everyone assumed didn't need checking on? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the strongest stories I've heard have started exactly there. If this one hit close to home, there's more coming. I post a new story every few days, so if you don't want to miss the next one, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.